There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them. It lives in sepia photographs and bronze plaques. It exists in the language of sacrifice, of duty, of men who answered a call and gave everything for something greater than themselves. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully curated. It is the version that governments needed to survive the aftermath. It is the version that families needed to endure the loss. And it is the version that has been handed down, generation after generation, smoothed of its roughest edges, cleaned of its particular smell, stripped of the sounds that men spent the rest of their lives trying to forget. The real war was not glorious. It was not even dramatic in the way that we tend to imagine violence. It was something far stranger and far more disturbing. It was routine. It was administrative. It was a war run by committees and timetables and supply requisitions, a war in which the death of 10,000 men was recorded in the same ledger format as a shortage of boot leather. What made the First World War historically unprecedented was not its scale alone, though the scale was incomprehensible. What made it unprecedented was the speed with which its most extreme conditions became ordinary, the speed with which men adapted to the unlivable, the speed with which institutions absorbed horror and filed it away. This is the story of 24 things that the First World War made normal, not heroic, not tragic in the literary sense, normal in the way that a factory worker stops noticing the noise of the machines after the first month, normal in the way that a morgue attendant stops seeing faces and starts seeing bodies, normal in the specific, bureaucratic, industrial sense that the war itself demanded. By the summer of 1914, Europe had spent decades preparing for a war it imagined would be short. The generals on all sides had studied the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, a conflict that lasted less than a year and resolved itself through decisive movement. They expected something similar, a war of maneuver, a war that would be over by Christmas, as the phrase went. That phrase is famous now. It is famous because of how completely, how almost immediately, it was proven wrong. Within weeks of the opening engagements on the Western Front, both sides had begun digging, and once they began digging, everything that followed became, in a very real sense, inevitable. The first thing that became normal was living underground, not metaphorically underground, literally. Men descended into the earth and did not come back up for weeks, sometimes months, at a stretch. The trench systems that eventually ran from the English Channel to the Swiss border were not improvised ditches. They became cities. They had names. They had streets. They had systems of drainage and rat control and mail delivery. They had chaplains and field surgeons and canteen workers. They had their own slang, their own internal geography, their own social hierarchies. A man who had been in the trenches long enough knew his section of the line the way a person knows their own neighborhood, knew which stretches were relatively safe, and which stretches were targeted by German snipers at predictable hours, knew which dugout had the fewest lice, and which latrine trench flooded when it rained. And it rained constantly. That is something that doesn't survive in most accounts of the war. The Western Front, particularly in Belgium and northern France, sits on clay. Clay does not drain. When artillery shells the ground, it does not merely destroy the surface, it ruptures the drainage entirely, creates craters that fill with water and do not empty. The result, after sustained bombardment, was a landscape that had ceased to resemble Earth in any conventional sense. It was a churned, waterlogged, gray-brown expanse that swallowed things. It swallowed equipment, it swallowed horses, and it swallowed men. Men drowned in shell craters in the middle of a battlefield, too exhausted to pull themselves out, too far from help for anyone to reach them. This happened not occasionally. This happened routinely. There are casualty reports that list cause of death as drowning and mean it literally, men who drowned in mud within 50 yards of their own lines. Living in that environment, men adapted. They adapted their bodies, and they adapted their minds. The second thing that became normal was the constant presence of rats. The rats of the Western Front were not the timid, shadow-dwelling creatures of peacetime cities. They were large, aggressive, and extraordinarily numerous, fed on a practically unlimited food supply. They nested in the walls of dugouts. They ran across sleeping men's faces. They ate food left unattended for even a few minutes. And they ate the dead. The men knew this. The men saw this. And after a certain point, most of them stopped reacting to it with anything resembling disgust, because disgust requires a comparison point. After enough weeks in the trenches, a rat eating a dead man's face in the dark became simply part of the environment. Some men killed rats for sport. Some men gave rats names. Some men genuinely could not remember years later that they had found this disturbing. The third thing that became normal was the smell. There is almost no honest written account of the Western Front that does not try, and largely fail, to describe the smell. It was not one smell. It was a composite. It was the smell of waterlogged clay and unwashed bodies, and the sharp chemical bite of chlorine and mustard gas drifting at low concentration, and the particular sweetish rot of flesh decomposing in wet ground. Men arrived at the front and spent the first days nauseated and then, without making any conscious decision, stopped noticing. The olfactory system, under sustained exposure, simply habituates. The brain stops processing the signal as meaningful. Veterans returning home described the strange disorientation of clean air. It smelled wrong to them. It smelled like absence. The dead were everywhere, and this was the fourth thing that became normal. Not the abstract fact of death, but the physical presence of corpses as permanent landscape features. In quiet sectors, bodies from earlier engagements lay in no man's land for months, sometimes longer. They could not be retrieved without exposing the living to sniper fire. They decomposed slowly in the cold, and when spring came, they decomposed faster. Men built their trench walls partly out of sandbags and partly out of whatever was available. And sometimes what was available was a body that had been in the ground long enough to have become more architectural than human. There are accounts of men going about their duties, brewing tea, writing letters home, while a partially exposed human foot or hand projected from the trench wall a few inches from their heads. They stopped seeing it. The brain categorizes and then files. After enough exposure, the foot became part of the wall. Military surgeons documented a phenomenon that they struggled to name. Men would arrive at the dressing stations not in a state of panic or acute trauma, but in a state of profound numbness. They had been trained to expect fear and instead found a kind of emptiness. This was, for many of them, more frightening than fear would have been, because it suggested that something fundamental had changed in how they were perceiving and processing reality. The surgeons gave this various names. The most common term used at the time, shell shock, described only one manifestation of a far broader collapse. But the language itself was telling. The medical establishment needed a word that located the problem in a specific cause, a specific event, rather than acknowledging that extended exposure to the conditions of the Western Front was sufficient, on its own, to fundamentally alter human consciousness. Because if you acknowledged that, you had to acknowledge that you were doing that to your own soldiers, deliberately, systematically, as a matter of policy. The fifth thing that became normal was the sound. The artillery barrages of the First World War were louder than anything in human history to that point. The largest bombardments, preceding the major offensives, could be heard from across the English Channel. Within earshot of a sustained barrage, the sound was not experienced as noise in the ordinary sense. It was total. It occupied the body as much as the ears. It produced a physical sensation of compression, of being pressed from outside. Men subjected to this for hours or days entered altered states. They lost track of time. They experienced dissociation. They became, in clinical terms, non-functional. And then, when the bombardment stopped, they stood up and went forward. Because the orders said to. Because everyone around them was going forward. Because the structure of the institution required it. And they had, by that point, internalized the institution so completely that their own judgment had become secondary. This is the sixth thing that became normal, and it is perhaps the most important one for understanding everything else. The individual will was subordinated, deliberately and effectively, to institutional procedure. This was not unique to military organizations, but it was executed in the First World War with a thoroughness that produced results no one had fully anticipated. Men who in civilian life were capable of independent moral reasoning, men who would not have followed clearly catastrophic instructions from an employer, followed those same instructions in the trenches because the surrounding framework made refusal unthinkable, not physically impossible, unthinkable in a deeper sense. The social world of the trenches, the hierarchy, the shared experience, the language, the schedules, the rituals, all of it created a reality in which the orders were simply the orders, and the orders were simply what happened next. Military discipline in the British Army during this period was enforced with a severity that the British public was not, at the time, fully informed about. Courts-martial proceeded at a rate that would have been shocking in peacetime. Men were shot for desertion. Men were shot for cowardice. These were official executions carried out by firing squads composed of men from the condemned soldiers' own unit. The British Army executed over 300 of its own soldiers during the war. Many of these men were, by any reasonable medical standard, suffering from what we would now recognize as severe psychiatric disorders. They were not cowards. They were broken. But the institution did not have a category for broken in a way that excused behavior. It had the category of duty fulfilled and the category of duty failed, and duty failed had consequences that were administered according to schedule, the same way rations were administered, and ammunition was administered, and replacement drafts were administered. The seventh thing that became normal was the rotation. Men went into the trenches and came out of the trenches and went back in again on a schedule that was, in its regularity, almost industrial. A typical rotation for British units involved several days in the frontline trenches, several days in the support trenches, several days in reserve, and then a period of rest before the cycle began again. Rest, in this context, was relative. Rest meant being far enough behind the line that you were not under direct fire, but close enough that you could hear the guns. Rest meant training exercises and fatigue duties and the administrative tasks that the army never stopped generating. The paperwork of the First World War was extraordinary in its volume. Every death required forms, every injury required forms, every disciplinary action required forms, every supply request required forms. The war generated paper at a rate that consumed entire forests. And somewhere in the chain of command, men whose primary occupation had become filling out forms about men dying continued to do so with the careful attention to procedure that the institution demanded. The eighth thing that became normal was the replacement system. When a unit suffered casualties, it was replenished from the rear. New men arrived, younger, often less trained, and were absorbed into the existing structure. The veterans, whatever that word meant after a few months at the front, were expected to integrate these replacements and continue. The replacements were often teenagers. The conscription systems of all the major powers eventually reached down to younger and younger age groups as the war consumed men faster than civilian life could produce them at the original eligible age. By the later years of the war, it was entirely normal for a unit to contain men who had been at the front for 2 and 3 years alongside boys who had been in secondary school the previous autumn. The institutional framework treated this as unremarkable. The paperwork recorded it. The schedules accommodated it. The war continued. The ninth thing that became normal was gas. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas at Ypres in April 1915 produced reactions of horror and outrage from the Allied powers and from neutral observers. It was described as monstrous, as barbaric, as a violation of civilized conduct. That moral position lasted in practical terms approximately as long as it took the Allies to develop their own gas programs and deploy them against German positions. Within a year, gas had become a standard tactical tool used by all sides, and the men in the trenches had adapted to it with the same systematic efficiency they applied to everything else. Gas masks became part of the daily kit. Gas drills became part of the daily routine. The recognition of different gas types, the distinctive smell of mustard, The bleach quality of chlorine, the faint, bitter almond of certain compounds, became a form of expertise that men developed the way a tradesman develops expertise in the materials of his trade. Mustard gas was particularly insidious because it did not kill quickly. It blistered the skin and the eyes and the lining of the lungs, producing injuries that were agonizing and slow. Men blinded by mustard gas were led in lines, each man with a hand on the shoulder of the man ahead, moving through the rear areas toward the dressing stations in columns that became one of the defining images of the later war. The men who were treated for gas injuries and recovered or partially recovered were returned to duty if at all possible. The institutional view was that a man who could walk and follow orders could serve in some capacity, and the demand for men was constant enough that partial incapacity was not, in itself, grounds for removal from the system. The 10th thing that became normal was the dressing station. The medical infrastructure of the First World War was vast, and by the standards of earlier conflicts, sophisticated. It was also overwhelmed from almost the beginning. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties. The medical system had been designed and had been confidently asserted by its architects to handle the expected flow. It handled approximately nothing like what appeared. The system improvised. It triaged. It made decisions about who could be saved and who could not, with a speed and a casualness that, outside the context of that particular crisis, would have constituted negligence or worse. Surgeons worked until their hands shook and continued working. Nurses performed procedures they had not been trained to perform because the trained personnel were occupied. The dead were moved to make room for the injured, and the injured were moved to make room for the newly arrived. And this process continued around the clock, day after day. Amputation was performed at a rate that, before the war, would have indicated some catastrophic failure of medicine. It became ordinary. The field surgeons of the First World War became extraordinarily skilled at amputation because they performed it constantly, and the speed at which they could perform it, the cleanliness of the cut, the management of the stump, improved through sheer repetition. A surgeon who had been a general practitioner in a small English town in 1913 had, by 1916, performed more amputations than most surgeons in previous centuries performed in a lifetime. This expertise existed. It was real, and it was produced entirely by the industrial-scale generation of injuries that the war created. The 11th thing that became normal was the wound. Not the concept of wounding, but the specific aesthetics of First World War wounds. The weapons of this war produced injuries unlike those of any previous conflict. High-explosive shells fragmented into irregular pieces of metal, moving at enormous velocity. These fragments produced wounds that were ragged and contaminated from the moment of impact, carrying with them not only metal but cloth and dirt, and whatever other material happened to be in the path. Shell fragment wounds were almost universally infected. The mud of the Western Front contained soil bacteria that thrived in anaerobic conditions, and wounds contaminated with that soil developed gas gangrene at a rate that the medical establishment had never previously encountered outside of isolated incidents. Gas gangrene killed quickly and unpleasantly, producing a recognizable smell that the medical staff learned to identify before seeing the wound itself. Men who survived the wounds and the infections and the amputations and the transport and the surgery were moved backward through the system to base hospitals, and then, if their condition warranted it, to hospitals in Britain or wherever their home country maintained them. These men returned to civilian life in varying states of damage. They returned missing limbs. They returned with facial disfigurements that had no precedent in peacetime medical practice. The First World War produced a specialization called facial reconstruction surgery, essentially from scratch, because the demand for it was immediate and enormous. Harold Gillies, a surgeon working in Britain, performed thousands of procedures on men whose faces had been partially or entirely destroyed by shell fragments or bullets. He improvised techniques. He failed repeatedly. He succeeded often enough that the specialty survived him and became the foundation of modern reconstructive surgery. None of this would have existed without the industrial-scale production of facial injuries that the war provided. The 12th thing that became normal was the letter home. The correspondence systems of the First World War were genuinely extraordinary in their scope. The British Army alone moved millions of pieces of mail per week. Men at the front wrote home, and families at home wrote to the men. And this traffic of paper sustained a connection between the world of the trenches and the world of civilian life that was, in retrospect, both remarkable and deeply strange. The letters that men sent home were censored. Officers read them before they were dispatched. Anything that revealed military information was removed. Anything that revealed the true conditions of life at the front was officially supposed to be moderated, though in practice the censorship was applied inconsistently enough that a great deal of authentic description made it through. What the letters reveal, read as a collection, is the adaptation process in real time. Early letters from men who had just arrived at the front are often shocked, often visceral, often struggling to find language for what they are experiencing. Letters from men who have been at the front for months are different in a specific way. They are matter of fact. They describe extraordinary things in the tone of the ordinary. A man writes that there was a bombardment last night that lasted several hours, and that Private such and such was killed, and that the rations were better than usual, and that he received the parcel and thank you for the socks, and that the weather has been wet. The bombardment and the death occupy the same register as the socks. This is not callousness in the usual sense. It is what psychological adaptation looks like when documented. The 13th thing that became normal was waiting. The First World War is remembered for its great offensives, the Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, operations that consumed hundreds of thousands of men in days or weeks. But between the offensives, which were episodic, there was the daily routine of static warfare, which was not. The daily routine involved standing watch at specific hours, performing specific maintenance tasks, eating at specific times, sleeping in specific shifts, and waiting. Waiting for the next bombardment, waiting for orders, waiting for the relief unit to arrive, waiting for the mail, waiting for the rotation to end. The experience of combat, of acute danger, occupied a relatively small percentage of the total time that most soldiers spent at the front. The majority of the time was spent in a condition of suspended readiness, knowing that the danger could arrive at any moment and being unable to do anything to prepare for it beyond what had already been done. This produced a psychological state that the psychiatrists of the time were not well equipped to describe. It was not simply boredom. It was the specific strain of maintaining alertness indefinitely in conditions of physical misery, sustained by the knowledge that relaxation could be fatal. Men who had spent months in this state developed specific behavioral patterns that their families noticed when they came home on leave. They startled at sudden noises. They could not sleep in normal beds. They sat with their backs to walls. They were often unable to speak about their experiences, not because they had decided not to, but because the gap between the world they were inhabiting and the world they had returned to was too large to bridge in language. The people who had not been there genuinely could not understand, and the men who had been there found that the attempt to explain produced a particular kind of exhaustion that was worse than not trying. The 14th thing that became normal was the leave system. Soldiers on all sides received periodic leave, periods of time away from the front, during which they were, in theory, recuperating. In practice, the leave system produced its own distinctive set of problems. Men who returned to Britain on leave found themselves in a world that had adapted to the war in a different way from how they had adapted. The civilian world was producing the war. It was manufacturing shells and uniforms and food and all the material that the industrial conflict required. It was reading about the war in newspapers that described it in terms that bore very little relation to what the men had experienced. It was applying social pressure to men who had not yet enlisted, pressure that the men returning from the front found difficult to process, because the thing being pressured toward was something they had been through and were about to return to and could not explain. The white feather campaigns, in which women presented white feathers symbolizing cowardice to men not in uniform, were organized civilian initiatives that operated with genuine conviction. The women participating in them believed they were doing something necessary. The men they sometimes approached included men who had been invalided out of service after being wounded, men who were on convalescent leave, men who were working in reserved occupations essential to the war effort. The campaigns produced incidents of genuine cruelty directed at men who had already suffered considerably. The institutional response to this was limited. The government eventually issued badges to men in reserved occupations and to wounded veterans to indicate their status, but the campaigns continued in modified form, and the social atmosphere they reflected, the expectation that every able-bodied man should be at the front, persisted. The 15th thing that became normal was propaganda. All of the major combatant nations developed propaganda operations of considerable sophistication. The British operation was among the most elaborate. It produced newspapers and pamphlets and photographs and, eventually, films. It managed the flow of information from the front with the specific goal of maintaining public support for a war that was, by any honest accounting, going badly for long stretches. The casualty figures were published with a delay and in a form that obscured their full scale. The language used to describe the fighting emphasized Allied progress and German losses, while presenting British losses in terms of sacrifice and valor rather than waste. The men who worked in these propaganda operations were not uniformly cynical. Some of them believed genuinely in what they were doing. Some of them were also aware that what they were doing was selective in its truth, and they found ways to accommodate that awareness. The institutional framework required the propaganda, and the propaganda required the men who produced it to subordinate their individual ethical positions to the institutional need. The same mechanism that operated in the trenches, scaled up and applied to the word, rather than the rifle. The 16th thing that became normal was the telegram. When a soldier died, his next of kin received a telegram from the War Office. The telegrams were brief and formulaic. They expressed the War Office's regret and informed the recipient of the fact of death. They did not describe the circumstances. They often arrived before any letter from the man himself, creating a strange temporal disruption in which families read a message informing them that the man was dead at a time when letters from him were still in transit. Letters written while he was alive, describing plans for his next leave, asking after the family, commenting on the weather. The telegram delivery system was operated by post office workers and in some cases by boy messengers, and these individuals developed over the course of the war their own adaptations to the work. A telegram from the War Office in certain kinds of envelope was immediately recognizable to anyone who had been living in Britain for more than a few months of the war. The post office worker handing it over and the recipient receiving it both knew, in the moment of the transaction, what it contained. The routine of the handover, the receipt, the door closing, became a scene that was performed hundreds of times a day across Britain, across France, across Germany, across every country that was feeding men into the system. It became a kind of theater that everyone knew the script to and that everyone dreaded being cast in. The 17th thing that became normal was the dead man's effects. When a soldier died, his personal effects were collected and eventually returned to his family. The army had procedures for this. There were forms. There were designated personnel. There were timelines. The effects were often returned months after the death, sometimes with accompanying letters from officers or fellow soldiers explaining the circumstances, sometimes without. The families received whatever had survived: a watch, a wallet, letters from home that he had been keeping, a Bible, a photograph. The objects were clean of the war in a way that the circumstances of death were not. They arrived in packets. They had been processed. They represented the formal end of the paperwork associated with one particular death, the closing of a file. The casualty notification system of the First World War was an administrative achievement of a peculiar kind. It managed, with considerable efficiency, the processing of approximately 40 million casualties across all combatant nations over 4 years. The forms existed for every contingency. There were forms for death and forms for wounding and forms for capture and forms for missing, and forms for the later determination of death when a man had been listed as missing for a sufficient period. There were appeals processes and review procedures. The institutional machinery of loss functioned in its way smoothly, which was itself a kind of horror that nobody at the time had quite the language to describe. The 18th thing that became normal was starvation. Not among the soldiers, who were fed according to official rations, though the quality and consistency of those rations varied enormously. Among the civilian populations of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary in particular, the Allied naval blockade produced food shortages of increasing severity as the war continued. By 1916 and 1917, German civilians were eating turnips as a primary food source. Children showed signs of malnutrition. The German government tracked caloric intake and found it dropping steadily below the minimum required for basic health. The population was not dying in the dramatic, visible way that soldiers were dying, but it was being systematically weakened in a way that had long-term consequences for the health of an entire generation. The German military and civilian authorities were aware of this and continued the war anyway, because the institutional logic that sustained the conflict was not responsive to the suffering of civilians in the way that might be expected. The calculation was not cruelty for its own sake. The calculation was that the cost of stopping was perceived as higher than the cost of continuing. This calculus, applied simultaneously by the governments of all the major combatant powers, was what made the war last as long as it did. Not fanaticism, not stupidity, though stupidity was certainly present at the command level. A structural inability to stop, because the institutional momentum of the war was by a certain point self-sustaining, and no individual actor had the leverage or the authority to bring it to a halt. The 19th thing that became normal was the mine. Underground warfare beneath the trenches was a specialized and terrifying subset of the broader conflict that produced its own culture and its own adapted men. Military engineers from both sides tunneled beneath the opposing trench lines and planted explosive charges that, when detonated, destroyed sections of trench and the men in them. The tunneling operations were conducted in near total darkness, in extremely confined spaces, under conditions of constant risk, not only from enemy counter-tunneling but from the physical instability of the ground itself, from gas pockets, from sudden flooding. The men who did this work, the sappers and miners, developed an expertise in listening to the earth, in hearing through the ground the sounds of enemy tunneling operations, in detecting the vibrations that indicated a chamber being packed with explosives. The detonation of the mines produced craters of enormous size. The largest, detonated at the opening of the Battle of Messines in June 1917, created an explosion that was heard in London. The craters became features of the landscape. Some became filled with water and became ponds. Some were incorporated into the defensive positions of the side that had survived the explosion. The landscape of the Western Front, by the later years of the war, had been altered at a fundamental level. The geology of the ground had been disrupted. The drainage had been destroyed. The topsoil had been displaced or contaminated to the point where nothing would grow in it for years afterward. This transformation of the physical land was not incidental. It was the direct result of the application of industrial processes to a piece of the Earth's surface, sustained over 4 years with extraordinary thoroughness. The 20th thing that became normal was the prisoner. The prisoner of war systems of all the major combatant nations grew enormously over the course of the war. By the end, there were millions of prisoners held on all sides, in camps that ranged from reasonably managed to deliberately brutal. The Geneva Convention provided a framework, and that framework was applied inconsistently, with significant variation between nations and between individual camps within nations. Prisoners were used as labor. In Germany, prisoners worked in mines and on farms and in industrial facilities. The labor of prisoners was factored into the economic planning of the war effort. They became a resource, categorized and allocated according to their skills and their physical capacity, processed through the same institutional machinery that processed everything else. Men who were captured and survived the war sometimes described their time in captivity as preferable to the trenches. not because the conditions were comfortable, but because the immediate threat of death was reduced. The captivity had its own miseries, hunger and cold, and the specific desolation of indefinite confinement, but it did not have the artillery, it did not have the gas, it did not have the standing water and the mud. Some men, in their later accounts, expressed something uncomfortably close to relief at having been captured, and then expressed guilt about that relief, because expressing relief at being taken prisoner implied a desire not to continue fighting that the social codes of the time branded as shameful. The 21st thing that became normal was the nurse. The First World War massively expanded the role of women in the formal structures of military medicine. Nurses served in enormous numbers on all sides, in base hospitals, in casualty clearing stations, in the hospital trains and ships that moved the wounded through the system. They worked under conditions of physical and psychological stress that were, in some respects, comparable to the conditions at the front, without the direct physical danger of the front, but with the sustained exposure to catastrophic injury and death that the front produced. The nurses who wrote memoirs and letters from this period describe the same process of adaptation that the soldiers describe, the same initial shock, the same gradual numbing, the same efficiency of procedure that develops as a defensive mechanism. Vera Brittain, who nursed at several locations including Malta and France, and who lost her brother and her fiancé and two close friends to the war, described the way that the body learned to continue functioning through grief, simply because the work did not stop and the patients in front of you could not wait for your grief to resolve itself. The institutional demand continued regardless of the individual's internal state, and the individual adapted to meet the demand. And what was left after the adaptation was not the same person who had begun. The 22nd thing that became normal was the mutiny. The French army mutinied in 1917 following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, an operation that had been promised to resolve the war and that produced instead enormous casualties and minimal gains. The mutinies were not, as the word might suggest, a general refusal to fight. They were more specific than that. The French soldiers who mutinied were, in many cases, willing to hold their defensive positions. They were not willing to participate in further offensive operations of the type that had been proving futile for years. They were, in institutional terms, negotiating. They were indicating a limit. The French command under Philippe Pétain, who replaced Nivelle, responded with a mixture of repression and reform. Courts-martial were convened. Executions were carried out. But the conditions were also, to some degree, improved. The rotation system was revised. Leave policies were adjusted. The men were, in a limited sense, heard. The mutinies were then suppressed as information, concealed from the German side and from the public, because the knowledge that the French army was in a state of significant internal breakdown would have had military and political consequences that the institution could not afford. The information remained classified for decades after the war. The 23rd thing that became normal was the disabled veteran. Men who had served in the war returned, when they returned at all, in states of physical damage that had no peacetime parallel. The pension systems and rehabilitation programs that existed before the war were not designed for anything approaching the scale or the severity of what the war produced. They were expanded and revised throughout the conflict, and they continued to be inadequate. Men who had lost limbs received prosthetics of varying quality and functional utility. Men who had lost sight or hearing received whatever the medical system of the time could offer, which was limited. Men who had been psychologically damaged received almost nothing, because the institutional frameworks for acknowledging and treating psychological damage from combat were rudimentary and were actively resisted by an administrative culture that could not absorb the implications of what acknowledging that damage would mean. The shell shock cases were a particular problem for the institution. If shell shock was a legitimate medical condition produced by the conditions of warfare, then the men who had been executed for cowardice or desertion while suffering from it had been, in some sense, executed for being ill. The institution could not follow that logic to its conclusion without delegitimizing a significant portion of its own disciplinary history, so the logic was not followed. The condition was acknowledged in a limited case-by-case way. The broader institutional implications were not addressed. They were not addressed during the war. They were not addressed after the war. The executed men remained officially convicted of their offenses for the rest of the century. The 24th thing that became normal was the memorial. The First World War produced memorials at a rate and on a scale that had no precedent. Every town in Britain, every village, every institution, every school, every workplace constructed some form of memorial to its dead. The memorials were built quickly, while the grief was still acute, and they were built according to forms that were developed as the war ended, and that became, within a few years, a standardized visual language of commemoration. The stone cenotaph, the bronze soldier, the lists of names, the inscriptions that spoke of sacrifice and honor and remembrance. The memorials performed a specific social function. They absorbed the grief and gave it a form that was public and shared and, crucially, that made the deaths mean something. The dead had not died randomly or pointlessly. The dead had given their lives, a formulation that implies agency and purpose, and they were honored for the giving. The memorial transformed the dead from casualties into sacrifices, and sacrifice is a category that carries meaning in a way that casualty does not. But beneath the memorials, the war continued to operate on the men who had survived it in ways that the memorials could not address. The veterans of the First World War carried their war with them for the rest of their lives in ways that were documented only partially, mostly by themselves in memoirs and poetry and letters, partly by the medical establishment in clinical records that were often sealed or lost. The men who had been most changed by the war were often the least able to speak about it, and the social environment of the interwar years, which alternated between a desperate desire to forget the war and a performative culture of commemoration, made it difficult to say anything honest about the experience without violating the frame of sacrifice that the culture needed to maintain. The institutions that had produced the war continued to exist. The armies that had fought it were demobilized and then rebuilt. The governments that had made the decisions continued to govern. The industrial systems that had manufactured the shells and the gas and the barbed wire turned to other productions. The war ended officially on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, a timing that was itself a bureaucratic choice. The armistice had been agreed in the early morning and could have taken effect immediately, but the symmetry of the hour was preferred, and in the hours between the signing and the ceasefire, men continued to be killed at a rate comparable to the preceding days of the war, approximately 11,000 casualties on the final morning, men who died. After the peace had already been agreed, in the administrative gap between the decision and its implementation, the war did not resolve the conditions that had produced it. The peace settlement at Versailles imposed terms on Germany that were punitive enough to generate lasting resentment without being thorough enough to prevent German rearmament. The new nations carved from the collapsed empires of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottomans were constructed along lines that guaranteed future conflicts. The colonial territories that had been administered by the Central Powers were redistributed to the victorious Allies, and the populations of those territories were not consulted in the redistribution. The League of Nations, intended to provide a framework for resolving future disputes without war, was established and then immediately weakened by the refusal of the United States, whose president had proposed it, to join. The men who had fought the war grew older. The men who had been teenagers in 1914 were in their 30s by the early 1930s. They watched the political conditions of Europe deteriorate with a recognition that their families and neighbors did not share, because they had seen what the deterioration of political conditions eventually produced. Some of them said so. Most of them were not effectively heard. The institutional memory of the war, the one that had been formalized in memorials and official histories and national narratives, was not the same as the experiential memory that the survivors carried in their bodies. And the institutional memory was the one that shaped policy. The Second World War began 21 years after the end of the First. Many of the men who fought it had been children during the First World War. Some of the men who commanded it had fought in the First War and carried, at the command level, the lessons they believed they had learned. The weapons were different. The tactics were different. But the industrial logic was the same subordination of individual life to institutional objective, the same bureaucratic machinery of mobilization and supply and casualty management, the same gap between the language used to describe the war to those at home and the reality experienced by those at the front. The First World War did not end. It mutated. The conditions it normalized, the expendability of individual human beings in the service of institutional objectives, the subordination of moral reasoning to procedural compliance, the administrative processing of death at industrial scale, these did not disappear when the guns stopped. They had been demonstrated to be possible. They had been demonstrated to function. The knowledge that they were possible, that a modern state with modern industrial capacity could mobilize and direct and expend millions of human lives according to schedule, was now available. It had been proven. It was in the record. The graves are maintained. The registries are complete. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains the cemeteries of the British Empire's dead, with the same standards applied to every grave, regardless of rank. The headstones are uniform. The grass is cut. The names are legible. The records show that the graves of approximately 1/3 of the British dead on the Western Front are marked with the phrase, "known unto God," meaning the remains could not be identified, meaning the man was destroyed thoroughly enough that what was left could not be connected to any particular name in any particular file, but was buried anyway in the cemetery under a stone, maintained in perpetuity by the institution that had sent him there.